When I was in sixth grade, my history teacher assigned us to complete our family tree. The idea was to demonstrate how we are all connected to history. I recall being disappointed when some of my classmates were able to produce rather extensive trees, and others could even name immigrant ancestors. But after that assignment, I was determined to find out as much as could be known about my ancestors. A couple of years later, I found that my Grandpa Allen had been on a genealogical quest of his own. He had gone looking for his Grandpa Allen's grave in Tennessee. Grandpa succeeded in finding the grave, and the story of how he discovered it was mythic. It involved fruitless hours wandering to dead ends, and finally encountering a wizened old man who led my grandpa and his brother Floyd through thick forest and undergrowth to a tall tablet with the inscriptions W.B. Allen and F.A. Allen. The discovery was so significant to my grandpa that his daughter had a painting made commemorating the quest. My father repeated the journey a few years later, and again, with the aid of an old stranger, found and photographed this family monument. A few decades later, I was ready to set out on my own pilgrimage. Unfortunately, my grandfather was gone, and so was my father's memory. But I thought I would find sufficient clues in the family history documents my grandfather left to me to locate the grave. There were no clear instructions. All I knew for sure was that the grave was in a Carrington Cemetery in Putnam County. I had a note about a Carrington Cemetery near Bloomington Springs, and I had a note that said the grave was in Carrington Cemetery, quote, across the hollow from West Cemetery. Thinking these two notes were referring to the same Carrington Cemetery, I spent a few years trying to reconcile the details. Early in my quest, I discovered there were two small Carrington cemeteries in Putnam County. Neither was anywhere near West Cemetery in Putnam County, so I set aside the West Cemetery clue and concluded the Carrington Cemetery near Bloomington Springs must be the correct one. However, several years later, I found a website where a county historian had surveyed and photographed the graves at the Carrington Cemetery near Bloomington Springs. No Allen graves were listed. This was a disturbing discovery because the other cemetery was not near Bloomington Springs, was not near West Cemetery, and its precise location was poorly described. I wondered if, perhaps, there was a third forgotten Carrington Cemetery. No, it turned out there was a second West Cemetery, and this West Cemetery indeed appeared to fit the across the hollow description. I had never noticed this cemetery because it is usually labeled on maps as Spring Creek Church. Now I had two descriptions of the location of the Carrington Cemetery that were broad-ranging but overlapped. But one was specific enough that I could place it largely within one owner's property, so I wrote him a letter. He responded that there were no cemeteries on his property, but he had seen a cemetery with a Langford headstone on a property that he had considered buying. When I told him I expected Langfords to be buried in the same cemetery, he said he would take me to it. So let it be known now and forevermore to all William Barton Allen Sr.'s posterity the location of his grave. From the West Cemetery at Spring Creek Church, go north on Fairview Road 3/10 of a mile, turn left on Thomas Allen Road, and drive 9/10 of a mile to an inset gate on the left. You can park your vehicle in the drive and continue on foot. If the gate's open, I would still recommend against driving your vehicle in unless it can handle off-road conditions, as the path may be washed out in some locations. On my visit, an off-road vehicle was required. Then you will want to follow the fence line down the west side of the property. This is the clearest and most level path to the cemetery. The wooded areas you see in this view fill in a steep-sided ravine, so I wouldn't recommend cutting across them unless you just enjoy hiking in those conditions. When you arrive at the cemetery site, you'll see a scene like this. You may prefer, though, to precisely locate the westernmost corner of the cemetery using the GPS on your smartphone. The coordinates can be found on findagrave.com, and I will also have them posted in the description of this video on YouTube. The first monument you encounter will likely be that of Thomas and Mary Langford. Thomas is both William Allen's first cousin and his brother-in-law by his second wife, Polly Langford, who is my second great-grandmother. He also appears to be the last person buried in this cemetery. With only a few exceptions, the graves at the West Cemetery are later than these, so it seems folks decided the West Cemetery was a better location. Even Thomas's grandson, Early Langford, who placed this monument, is buried at the West Cemetery. When you take a couple of steps past the Langford Monument, you will find the toppled headstone of William and Fanny Allen. My guess is that it probably fell forward when a tree growing in the grave was blown over, and then someone turned it face up after they removed the tree trunk. Judging from the location of the footstone, I suspect the headstone is in the correct position, marking the graves. Here I am looking at William and Fanny's footstone, and you can see my guide cleaning the headstone in the background. I believe the engraved headstone and footstone for William and Fanny may not be the original markers, because close on either side there were fieldstones marking the heads and feet of two graves. One had an inscription that looks like it may be F.A., and it also appears a date is inscribed. Given the right conservation, this stone may still be legible. It may also indicate that the later headstone has the position of the graves backward, or the stones were set backward. Unexpectedly, I also found an infant-sized grave. There was no inscription, but I suspect this may be Fanny's stillborn child. If you haven't heard of William's first wife, Fanny, her birth name was Frances Isabel Jones. She was Leander Allen's mother and died giving birth to her second child. There's no record of William having a fourth child, so I assume both mother and child were lost. Now that the mystery of the cemetery location is solved, let's go back to West Cemetery and get a look at that view across the hollow. Here I am scanning across the horizon, across the hollow from roughly southwest to northwest. It turns out if you look straight down the drive entering the West Cemetery and across the hollow, you will see the field adjacent to the Carrington Cemetery. In fact, and unfortunately I didn't take a picture of it, you can see the Spring Creek Church from that field. Sadly, the weather prevented me from taking a nicer picture, but certainly one could say Carrington Cemetery is across the hollow from West Cemetery. And finally, let's take a look at the satellite view of the relative position of the two cemeteries. Notice the trees are thinner in the triangular-shaped cemetery, and notice the position of the cemetery high above a sharp bend in Mill Creek. The next time I go, I want to see if I can hike down and get a look at that creek. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it.